pitched the United States against Japan in some of the bitterest fighting in the history of warfare. On both sides, thousands of lives were being sacrificed. America's answer was to develop a weapon so awesome that it would end the fighting almost at a stroke. Billions of dollars were plowed into ensuring that the USA would be the first nation in the world to have the atomic bomb. What the Americans did not know, and what many are unaware of to this day, was that they were actually engaged in a race. Their enemy, Japan, was also working on a nuclear program. Not one, but two teams of Japan's top scientists were engaged in a desperate bid to develop the bomb. They had completed the first crucial steps, and they even have detonated a nuclear explosion. The Western Allies had no inkling that the Japanese program was so advanced. They did not know that with just a little more time, the course of World War II might have taken a very different turn. The Second World War ended when the United States used atomic bombs against the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The devastation was so complete that the Japanese surrendered within days of the second strike. Although Japan was much criticized for its wartime brutality, it won universal sympathy as the victim of this terrifying new weapon. But Japan's scientists, unknown to the world and to America in particular, had set out to harness the same destructive force in a weapon of their own. Once defeat was inevitable, the Japanese set about destroying their military secrets. Orders were given for all evidence of scientific and weapons research to be burned. In those last frantic days before the arrival of the conquering Americans, mountains of papers and files from the bomb project went up in smoke. But one survived. In Tokyo, amid the chaos of surrender, a bomb team member handed the salvaged file to a brilliant young scientist named Kazuo Kuroda, a member of a different team.
He asked him to protect him, and he said, because your name is not on any of the documents, and so you wouldn't be prosecuted as a war criminal. Okay? And so he kept them, and he promised to take care of those documents.
After the war, Professor Kuroda emigrated from Japan to America, to the University of Arkansas.
He had come to the United States in 1949, one of the first group of Japanese scientists to be allowed to come to the United States after the war, and had come on a special visa, kind of a visa that the German rocket scientists came in under.
These are chopsticks, used like this.
Professor Kuroda often entertained students and colleagues at his home. Here, guests were shown an extraordinary document.
Is this high?
It was on maybe one or two or three of those occasions that I, in fact, saw these secret plans to build the atomic bomb.
About Japanese atomic bomb.
Really?
Our bomb?
He would show them to students. None of them could read Japanese, but you know, he made reference to the fact that had they been successful, it would probably have been used.
Remarkably, this explosive secret didn't escape from the Arkansas campus into the wider world. But after Kuroda's death in 2001, his widow decided to make his papers public. After nearly 50 years, Japan's most sensitive war secret was about to become public knowledge. How would Japanese wartime scientists, silent for so long, react to this new evidence? Yoichiro Nambu is a distinguished Japanese nuclear scientist who emigrated to the USA in 1952. Although not himself a member of the nuclear weapons team in Japan, he was their contemporary. Professor Nambu had not known that Kuroda's document existed.
I didn't know that they had this much information. Yeah.
The seemingly dead document suddenly comes alive when Professor Nambu spots the name of one of his friends.
Mr. Kigoshi, I knew Kigoshi myself. He's my fellow student in Tokyo.
Kuroda's document describes a team developing weapons-grade uranium and names Kunihiko Kigoshi as a member. Today, he's the sole survivor of those named in the papers. This is the first time he has talked of the project on camera, and the first time he has seen Kuroda's evidence.
How did you get hold of this?
Kigoshi's name appears prominently in the document.
Other names should be written here as well. Strange that only my name appears here.
Cautiously, Professor Kigoshi begins to describe the project he worked on during the war. At first, he denies that weapons were involved.
In no way did I consider a weapons project. All I could think of was the fact that we could extract energy from it. The military perhaps did think of using it either as an energy source or as something like bomb. But juniors like me knew nothing of these things.
The first atomic bomb program had been initiated by the military. In the spring of 1941, Tatsusuburo Suzuki, at that time a young lieutenant colonel, contacted the prestigious Riken Research Institute on the outskirts of Tokyo with a commission. The nuclear laboratory there was run by Professor Yoshia Nishina, a physicist, distinguished enough that he had a commemorative postage stamp issued in 1990. Suzuki informed the professor that the Japanese Army was commissioning him to develop a nuclear weapon. Nishina began assembling a team.
Professor Nishina asked me just before I graduated whether I wanted to join his lab. He said that if I did, I might not have to join the army.
So Kigoshi became a member of the team. Among the faces in the Riken Group photograph of more than 60 years ago, another scientist, Professor Ryohei Nakane, proved to be still alive today. He is less guarded about the true nature of their project.
I was in my third year at Osaka University when Professor Nishina started the A-bomb project, and he recruited students who were studying nuclear physics, in particular isotopes. So when Nishina asked my supervisor to send one student from his lab, I was the one sent there.
Nakane was about to become part of a small and inexperienced team that had quite a job on their hands: build an atom bomb. The simplest way to build an atom bomb in the 1940s was to use uranium, but not uranium in its natural occurring form. 1 part in X thousand of this radioactive metal is of a slightly different form, known as uranium-235. If a quantity of uranium-235 is bombarded with a stream of neutrons, its atoms split with devastating force. A nuclear explosion. Kigoshi's job was to turn uranium into a gas so that the uranium-235 could be separated. Nobody in Japan had achieved this feat.
At first, I had no idea how to go about it.
Uranium gas is so corrosive that normal materials can't contain it. So even making the flask was a project in itself.
In order to make the brass solder, we made and tested many types of flaxes and solders. This produced all sorts of gases, and the workers who were conducting the tests would come up to me and say, "Are you trying to kill us?"
One problem was solved, but according to the document, the mixture was likely to be unstable.
It only exploded once. When it reacted, this thing broke and was blown off.
Kuroda's document and the scientists' reaction to it establishes that Japan was engaged on a nuclear weapons program in direct competition with the United States. But was it a real contest? Could a small group of Japanese scientists compete with the massively resourced might of the Manhattan Project? In America, the secret Manhattan Project was spending its way through the equivalent of $30 billion in its quest to develop an atomic bomb. It employed 130,000 people working at full stretch. Could the Japanese, with their much smaller resources, possibly have been making comparable progress?
The Manhattan Project of the United States was unprecedented in its size and scope and could only have been successful because of its size and scope and the enormous amount of resources dedicated to simultaneously developing several unknown, very complicated engineering projects.
The Japanese project was tiny by comparison. Kigoshi's staff could be counted on one hand.
The project didn't have tremendous support in the beginning because it was going to be something that they knew was going to take several years, if not more, and they thought the war was going to end soon, and it didn't have really the support.
But whatever the odds, the team did make steady progress. Their goal was achieved, and the gas reproduced, as Professor Kigoshi can finally admit.
I did not think that something like this document would emerge. It says that it was finally made.
Their resources may have been less lavish than the Americans, but their scientists were first-rate. Nishina had been a student of Niels Bohr in Copenhagen, where he was very highly regarded. In addition, the Japanese scientists were driven by extraordinary zeal. And as the war began to go against them, desperation. For the Japanese, defeat was unthinkable. Most would do anything to avoid such a humiliation. Not just the military, but the scientists were rooted in the century-old tradition of the samurai warrior code of honor and loyalty, even to the death.
Nishina comes from the samurai tradition, so they all wanted to serve the country and something like that.
It is impossible for young people now to understand the way of thinking of the time. You have to have experienced the war in order to understand. We were educated through militarism from the primary school level. We were prepared for this at any moment.
But as the war progressed, the nightmare possibility of defeat suddenly became a reality. America was destroying their navy and approaching ever closer to their homeland. Along with their drive to perfect the bomb, the search for effective weapons took on a feverish intensity and an extraordinary level of ingenuity. One of their ideas was a missile known as the Oka. Made of cheap materials, plywood and aluminum, it could be launched from aircraft or from rails, as at this coastal site. This missile was primarily a glider, and the catch was it required human guidance, pilots who would never return.
Japanese engineer said that the Japanese have given this missile eyes, only the type of eyes the Japanese could give to this sort of weapon, meaning a human being. These were used with varying degrees of efficacy. They did manage to sink a few American naval ships with them.
Big guns, little guns, all guns went to work. The lesson.
Although Oka was a dismal failure, eerily suicide pilots were not. Known as kamikazes, they would become a strength in the Japanese war effort.
Some kamikazes got through and heavy damage was done to American warships.
Kamikaze pilots were so fierce that they struck terror in the hearts of American sailors. The desperation to hold off the Allies made its way into the classroom. Thousands of balloons manufactured by Japanese schoolchildren were loaded with incendiary bombs and anti-personnel devices and launched into the Pacific jet stream, which took them straight across to North America. Although they were easy targets for U.S. fighter pilots, about 500 made it to the mainland, causing numerous forest fires and several deaths. The only fatalities inflicted on the United States mainland in the entire war. And the material used for these balloons? Paper. Japan was far more sophisticated and potentially deadly under the sea.
The E-400 class was the largest submarine built of the Second World War. The E-400 class was close to 6,000 tons displacement submerged.
This was 3 times the size of the biggest U.S. vessel, large enough to house 3 aircraft. It was nothing less than an underwater aircraft carrier.
They designed a special aircraft that would be capable of folding its wings in sort of a bug-like fashion while it was inside the submarine hangar. And then they would be brought out on the deck when the submarine is surfaced. The wings would be opened up, a large bomb would be attached, and the aircraft would be launched with a catapult.
The aim was to destroy the locks of the Panama Canal, denying America's Atlantic Fleet direct access to the Pacific Ocean and to Japan.
The submarine would perhaps be 100 miles or so off of Panama, and the aircraft would go directly to the canal and drop a dive bombing type of explosive into the locks. And of course the locks are very complex, very large. You have to carry a sizable bomb at a minimum of 500 pounds.
But as the military outlook for Japan worsened, work on the nuclear research program intensified. It was clear that the atom bomb was the only weapon that could save Japan. There was still a long way to go, but the Japanese team was catching up. At the Riken laboratories in Tokyo, the Japanese atomic bomb project had reached a critical stage. Thanks to Kigoshi and his team, Professor Nishina had the uranium gas he needed. Now he faced a critical choice. There were several ways to attempt to extract weapons-grade uranium from the gas. It could be heated, filtered, spun at high speed, or subjected to strong electromagnetic fields. No one knew which would work best. The Americans, with their huge resources, simply tried all 4 methods. Nishina had to decide on one. Because it involved the least new development of ultra-high-tech hardware, he chose the method known as thermal diffusion. Very high temperatures would drive some of the active isotope out through a different channel. The Imperial Army officer overseeing the project, Tatsusaburo Suzuki, monitored progress.
For one method, thermal diffusion, we had built installations. We had built a separator, and we conducted experiments with nuclear fission on the basis of uranium hexafluoride. We had got as far as that.
Uranium was the next problem. America had plenty of local supplies for its bomb project. Japan had next to nothing.
I was given an assignment to find uranium resources. Since we desperately needed uranium ore, we searched for it around Korea, Manchuria, and Malaysia. Though we did not find actual uranium ore, we found a mineral which contained a good volume of uranium, better than any other minerals in Korea.
Japan's wartime alliance with Germany was uneasy at the best of times. The Germans had stocks of uranium, but would they agree to share it with Japan?
Professor Nishina had sent a telegram to Germany asking them to send some uranium over. At the time, I was the one answering the queries regarding what it was going to be used for. So I filed the request telling them that we needed to use it as a catalyst.
Higoshi's little lie did not fool the Germans, but Hitler's Third Reich was on the verge of collapse. Well aware of what uranium was useful for, they agreed to send some. Getting it to Japan, however, was another matter.
They're separated by 12,000 miles, and there are no direct air routes over communist Russia. And so the only way the Germans and the Japanese could communicate in a physical way was by submarines that weren't designed as cargo carriers. And yet, that's the only conduit they had open.
In March 1945, a German U-boat set out from the port of Kiel. Its manifest showed that it was carrying 1,000 pounds of uranium oxide, enough, after processing, for probably 2 atomic bombs. While America knew that Germany had a nuclear program, they had dismissed the idea that Japanese scientists could be doing anything significant. The Americans, who had long since cracked Japan's naval ciphers, were in for a shock.
We knew everything they carried because we always had the manifests, because we read the codes and ciphers. And we knew that it was carrying nuclear material.
Nishina's Riken processor was working. The uranium was on its way. The Japanese could see success within their grasp. Then, disaster struck. In March and April 1945, the U.S. launched a series of devastating firebomb attacks on the Japanese mainland. The bombs, dropped from hundreds of B-29 bombers, created firestorms that swept through Japanese cities with a destructive force exceeding even that of the eventual atom bombs. The Riken Institute was in the path of one such conflagration.
This is a picture just after the air raid. This is the place exactly where the thermal diffusion cylinder was. Yes, April 14th in the morning. This is the exact site.
14日の朝に焼けてしまった。ここです。
The crucial component in uranium processing was gone. Meanwhile, the uranium-carrying U-boat was still on its way to Japan. But historic events again intervened. During the submarine's long voyage, Germany was finally defeated. Adolf Hitler committed suicide, and his successor, Admiral Dönitz, ordered all naval vessels to surrender to the nearest Allied power. The U-boat, by now well out into the North Atlantic, was close to Canada, but the Americans got to it first.
In fact, there is some suggestion that the Americans deliberately jammed the Canadian radio broadcasts out to the U-234 when it ran up a black flag and it was to surrender, so that the Americans would have this particular submarine. The United States wanted to make certain that the U-234 surrendered to American forces and not to Canadian forces.
The submarine was seized along with its uranium and escorted to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. 2 months later, the Manhattan Project completed its first atomic bomb, but the Japanese venture seemed doomed.
The story of Nishina's program is convenient for a lot of people because it says they had a little interest, they tried, maybe they were doing a little bomb work, and it got bombed out anyway before the end of the war, and that's all they did. That's a very nice story for those who don't want to deal with the facts.
And the facts are that the Japanese had not invested all their nuclear effort in the Tokyo project. There was a second secret bomb program controlled by the Navy, but not on the Japanese mainland. Japan's nuclear project in Tokyo was in ruins, but Japan had an even more closely guarded nuclear secret. A second, quite separate bomb project started by the Navy some months after the Army's program, but not in Japan. The two sectors of the armed forces were bitter rivals. The Navy scientists were every bit a match for Nishina. They included a future Nobel Prize winner, Hideki Yukawa.
I believe that the real story is beyond Nishina. It is involved in the Navy program, which spent more money on it, which was more desperate, and which is more secretive.
The Japanese Navy had already sustained massive losses. In the face of defeat, their leaders were ready for desperate measures.
The Navy, as the war got worse and worse, started putting more stock in suicide planes. And one of the things they wanted to do was to put an atomic bomb in a suicide plane, which they would send against the fleet that was going to come and invade Japan. They were also thinking of putting it on a submarine. One idea floated was to put the submarine into the San Francisco Bay.
American bombing was a danger to the Navy project too, but Robert Wilcox believes that the most significant part of the scheme had been removed from the mainland. Wilcox has sifted through hundreds of U.S. intelligence reports written during the closing stages of World War II.
We have numerous documents showing that all factories that could be moved were sent over to Korea, and that's where I think that the Navy program went. We do have these consistent reports that they had a plant there, the NZ plant, and that they were working on atomic nuclear bomb there at the NZ plant.
Korea was the ideal place for such a project.
North Korea grew by 1940 to be the engine of Japan's war effort. It was one of the largest industrial areas in the world. It certainly was the largest concentration of high-tech industry and electro power in Asia at the time.
Power was a crucial factor in full-blown nuclear bomb manufacture. The Japanese, like the Americans, were discovering that uranium processing plants required as much power as a small city. The Manhattan Project had always been given as much power as it needed, and it seemed that in Korea, the Japanese project was catching up. As well as electricity, Korea had ample supplies of another vital resource, labor.
In the summer of 1945, they had to use people to dig tunnels where they were planning to put the machinery underground in anticipation of bombing raids. And so prisoners of war were used there, as were numerous unskilled workers taken from the countryside in Korea, as were Japanese students whose schools were shut down, and a whole host of other people were involved in digging these tunnels.
Japan could only hope their massive mobilization of labor would pay off, because this would certainly be their last chance. Then came August 6, 1945. America's huge investment in nuclear research paid off.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy.
America had won a race they scarcely knew they were in. The loser, Professor Nishina, was mortified. He wrote this remarkable letter to his bomb team.
If President Truman's statement is true, the time has come for us, as the members of the project, to commit suicide by harakiri. I will tell you when to do it, when I come back from Hiroshima. So please await my return. US and British scientists have won a great victory against the Japanese scientists, the scientists of Building 49 at the Riken. It is nothing less than that the personality of US-British scientists was far superior to Japanese scientists.
Nishina's assistant, Kigoshi, who had left Tokyo after the firebombing, now returned, hoping to visit Nishina.
I had to walk a long way across the ruins that were burnt to the ground to get to the science labs. Professor Nishina was not around at that time. However, his secretary, Mrs. Yokoyama, suddenly told me that the professor wanted him and me to commit harakiri together. When I laughed out loud, she said, with a serious look on her face, that it was no laughing matter. The Professor Nishina was serious about it.
In the end, Nishina thought better of his plan. And soon, things took an even worse turn. President Truman ordered another atomic bomb strike, this time on the city of Nagasaki.
If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth.
The military supervisor of Japan's bomb project went to examine the ruined cities firsthand.
I flew over Hiroshima and Nagasaki at low altitude. And saw that the results were devastating. But it was the work of the enemy. I saw that this weapon was horrible. It worked well against armies and military bases. But it was cruel to use it against cities. Nonetheless, The first thing I thought of was that we had to strike back fast.
そんなことを思いました。しかし一番
Of course, I didn't know that the war was about to end.
向こうに越されたんですけど、こちらも
I wanted us to have such a weapon ready as soon as possible.
いくらでか早くこういうものを作りたいなと、そういうことを。
But the task for the Japanese to perfect their atomic bomb was immense, and time was not on their side. The Japanese situation was desperate. Two major cities had been annihilated by America's atomic bombs. But even now, the Japanese Empire resisted defeat, searching for any way to stave off the inevitable. According to one report, they made one last-ditch effort. They conducted a nuclear test. Immediately after the war, David Snell, an American journalist at that time in the U.S. Army, had an extraordinary encounter in Korea with a Japanese intelligence officer who stated he was attached to Japan's atomic bomb program. He claimed to have been an eyewitness at the detonation of Japan's first atomic bomb.
Shortly after midnight of that day, a convoy of Japanese trucks moved from the mouth of the cave, past watchful sentries. The trucks wound through valleys, past sleeping farm villages. It was August, and frogs in the mud of terraced rice paddies sang in a still night. In the cool pre-dawn, Japanese scientists and engineers loaded Genzai Bakudan, the bomb, aboard a ship in Konan. Off the coast near an islet in the Sea of Japan, more frantic preparations were underway. All that day and night, ancient ships, junks, and fishing vessels moved into the anchorage. On August the 12th, a robot launch chugged through the ships at anchor and beached itself on the inlet. Its passenger was Genzai Bakudan. A clock ticked. The observers were 20 miles away. This waiting was difficult and strange to men who had worked relentlessly so long and who knew their job had been completed too late. The light in the east where Japan lay grew brighter. The moment the sun peeped over the sea, there was a burst of light at the anchorage, blinding the observers who wore welder's glasses. The ball of fire was estimated to be 1,000 yards in diameter. A multicolored cloud of vapors boiled towards the heavens, then mushroomed in the stratosphere.
Snell's story was published in 1946. It was reproduced around the world, but was soon lost in the fast-moving developments of the post-war years. No further backup of Snell's story emerged, but he was a respected journalist who went on to gain a reputation for his integrity.
I was able to find David Snell in Texas. He was a retired person at this time. And he told me, yes, it all happened. He said, exactly as I wrote it, I believed it. The man, the security agent was a high-level officer, and I believed him. Most assuredly, I believed him. He is a sterling gentleman, and I believed him.
If Snell's eyewitness was correct, Japan had all but caught up with the United States. But there is still a large gap between exploding a test device and successfully launching it against an enemy. And now, Japan was dealing not only with America, but with a declaration of war by the Soviet Union. Whatever the facts of the Korean test, it was already too late. Bombed to destruction, assailed on all sides by their enemies, Japan finally announced its surrender on August 14, 1945. The records of the Tokyo bomb project were burnt by the scientists themselves. The evidence from Korea simply disappeared. Soviet troops had fought their way across the border into what is now North Korea, site of Japan's alleged bomb factory and bomb test.
They came and took away machine parts from Hangnam's fertilizer factory. Pipes, motors. They stole so many machine parts to bring back to Russia. I even saw them taking away a farmer's cow and loading it onto the plane.
Anything that was anything in terms of manufacturing, in terms of military equipment, they just picked up and took back with them. So if the Japanese had anything in North Korea, it's in my guess that it went to Russia and it went fast.
In Korea, the NZ plant in particular became a focus of Soviet interest.
Now, as a result of the highly secret nature of this particular plant, the Russians were very interested in it, and some of the people who worked there, 6 of the researchers who worked there, were initially taken away as war criminals by the Russians. 5 of them were convicted, and 1 of them was not, who was let go, and there's no explanation of why.
Once the Soviets were in control of Korea, access was denied to the rest of the world. The whole area where the NZ plant once stood, and the island off Hangnam, where David Snell's eyewitness claimed to have watched a nuclear test, are now part of North Korea. They are still closed to outsiders. Meanwhile, the Americans, arriving in triumph in Tokyo, found that evidence of the nuclear project there had already been reduced to ashes. Even so, they took a close interest in the buildings.
Every day, I would go to the science lab, and one morning when I went, they were pulling down the walls. I heard all this noise coming from inside the campus grounds, and I wondered what was going on. When I went to see, they were cutting the big cyclotron into small pieces using a hydrogen burner.
Nishina protested strongly, but the cyclotron ended up in pieces in Tokyo Bay.
Well, it was explained as a mistake, but in truth, it was not a mistake. We found out something. We found out they were lying. We found out that there was much more going on that they hadn't told us about, including possibly we were getting whiffs already of Korea. And that was the reason that order from the War Department to destroy every single piece of equipment they had was given.
It is not hard to see why Japan's secret remained buried for so long. It was not in anyone's interest to reveal it. Even now, final confirmation is impossible. Any evidence not burnt by the Japanese themselves was destroyed by the Americans. The evidence from Korea, including the scientists, was annexed by the Russians. The Japanese were certainly not anxious to draw attention to their own atomic bomb project, and the Americans may well have been both shocked and embarrassed by the failure of their intelligence. There had been plenty of hints about the Japanese interest in nuclear physics, but they had not been followed up. The Americans just hadn't believed that Japan had the resources to develop an atom bomb, or that their scientists were capable of creating one.
Americans saw the Japanese as I mean, if you look at the cartoons of the day, the Japanese were next to apes. They were next to monkeys. They were depicted this way, slant-eyed. They couldn't possibly fly because they couldn't see very well. They didn't have the balance because their mothers had carried them on their backs, and their balance was off when they were carrying. Japan was a backward country. If they looked at Americans, they would lose just looking at us. Well, we greatly underestimated them.
The message is don't underestimate anybody. All of us tend to have, every civilization tends to have made that mistake. We in the South underestimated the damn Yankees. The British underestimated George Washington. We all underestimate people, and it generally is to our harm.
young scientist named Kazuo Kuroda, a member of a different team.
He asked him to protect him, and he said, because your name is not on any of the documents, and so you wouldn't be prosecuted as a war criminal. Okay? And so he kept them, and he promised to take care of those documents.
After the war, Professor Kuroda emigrated from Japan to America, to the University of Arkansas.
He had come to the United States in 1949, one of the first group of Japanese scientists to be allowed to come to the United States after the war, and had come on a special visa, kind of a visa that the German rocket scientists came in under.
These are chopsticks used like this.
Professor Kuroda often entertained students and colleagues at his home. Here, guests were shown an extraordinary document.
Is this high?
It was on maybe 1 or 2 or 3 of those occasions that I, in fact, saw these secret plans to build the atomic bomb.
About Japanese atomic bomb.
Really?
Our bomb? Our bomb?
He would show them to students. None of them could read Japanese, but you know, he made reference to the fact that
War pitched the United States against Japan in some of the bitterest fighting in the history of warfare. On both sides, thousands of lives were being sacrificed. America's answer was to develop a weapon so awesome that it would end the fighting almost at a stroke. Billions of dollars were plowed into ensuring that the USA would be the first nation in the world to have the atomic bomb. What the Americans did not know, and what many are unaware of to this day, was that they were actually engaged in a race. Their enemy, Japan, was also working on a nuclear program. Not one, but 2 teams of Japan's top scientists were engaged in a desperate bid to develop the bomb. They had completed the first crucial steps, and may even have detonated a nuclear explosion. The Western Allies had no inkling that the Japanese program was so advanced. They did not know that with just a little more time, the course of World War II might have taken a very different turn. The Second World War ended when the United States used atomic bombs against the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The devastation was so complete that the Japanese surrendered within days of the second strike. Although Japan was much criticized for its wartime brutality, it won universal sympathy as the victim of this terrifying new weapon. But Japan's scientists, unknown to the world and to America in particular, had set out to harness the same destructive force in a weapon of their own. Once defeat was inevitable, the Japanese set about destroying their military secrets. Orders were given for all evidence of scientific and weapons research to be burned. In those last frantic days before the arrival of the conquering Americans, mountains of papers and files from the bomb project went up in smoke. But one survived. In Tokyo, amid the chaos of surrender, a bomb team member handed the salvaged file to a brilliant...
Been successful, it would probably have been used.
Remarkably, this explosive secret didn't escape from the Arkansas campus into the wider world. But after Kuroda's death in 2001, his widow decided to make his papers public. After nearly 50 years, Japan's most sensitive war secret was about to become public knowledge. How would Japanese wartime scientists, silent for so long, react to this new evidence? Yoichiro Nambu is a distinguished Japanese nuclear scientist who emigrated to the USA in 1952. Although not himself a member of the nuclear weapons team in Japan, he was their contemporary. Professor Nambu had not known that Kuroda's document existed.
I didn't know that they had this much information. Yeah.
The seemingly dead document suddenly comes alive when Professor Nambu spots the name of one of his friends.
Mr. Kigoshi, I knew Kigoshi myself. He's my fellow student in Tokyo.
Kuroda's document describes a team developing weapons-grade uranium and names Kunihiko Kigoshi as a member. Today, he's the sole survivor of those named in the papers. This is the first time he has talked of the project on camera, and the first time he has seen Kuroda's evidence.
How did you get hold of this?
Kigoshi's name appears prominently in the document.
Other names should be written here as well. Strange that only my name appears here.
Cautiously, Professor Kigoshi begins to describe the project he worked on during the war. At first, he denies that weapons were involved.
In no way did I consider it a weapons project. All I could think of was the fact that we could extract energy from it. The military perhaps did think of using it either as an energy source or as something like bomb. But juniors like me knew nothing of these things.
The first atomic bomb program had been initiated by the military. In the spring of 1941, Tatsusuburo